Yes. Oh, I think everybody should have seen that. If you want to continue, to just click to continue. Anyway, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. Like I said before, it is so good to see all of you. This program actually was initially scheduled a year ago this month on June 3rd, but the COVID-19 came and we had to cancel, and it was before we were Zoom proficient or even really knew what Zoom could do. So here we are tonight, and we're very, very thankful and appreciative that Dr. Bill Durston is available again tonight to share with us his experiences, his research, and best ways to prevent gun violence. Again, my name is Francine Freitas, and Charlene Harris and I will be your co-facilitators tonight. Charlene?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending.
We also want to say thank you to Doug Thompson. Doug is our Zoom specialist extraordinaire. So thank you, Doug, for all that you do. So tonight's agenda is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to start with an opening prayer and an introduction, and then Dr. Durston will begin his presentation. We will end tonight's program just as we started, with a closing prayer. Our goal is to be through as close to 8 o'clock as possible. Time has been allotted for questions and answers. However, instead of waiting until the end of the presentation, you can ask your questions during the presentation. Bill encourages, welcomes, and expects questions to be raised during his presentation. Charlene and I will be monitoring those questions. And so what you'll be using for that purpose is the chat function. So with your questions, if you have any questions, just type them into the chat. And then Charlene and I will be monitoring those questions, and will alert Bill when we have sufficient questions to be asked. We will make every effort to answer all your questions. We also would like to remind you to mute your microphones, and also to remind everyone that this is being recorded. So with that, let's start with a prayer. Loving God, another mass shooting has harmed or taken the lives of several innocent people. We pray that all people will realize the profound impact gun violence has. Help us to be peaceful and diplomatic in times of trouble. Guide us towards peace and away from violence. Help us to avoid partaking in any evil or illegal acts. Allow us to solve all of our problems in a constructive way rather than resort to destruction. Let us pray for the countless victims of gun violence. Help them to feel comforted in a world that seems like it is full of evil. Motivate all people in a position to help the victims of gun violence, such as rescue workers, to do as much as they can to help. Lastly, let us pray for politicians and government leaders. Let them do all they reasonably can to prevent more violent acts. Inspire them to do all they can in an effort to reduce and eventually eradicate gun violence. I am very, very pleased to introduce our presenter tonight, Dr. Bill Durston. Bill has been involved in various local and national organizations advocating for firearm injury prevention throughout his professional career. Prior to his retirement, he was a board-certified emergency physician for 35 years and has treated innumerable gunshot victims. Though retired, he continues to practice medicine as a clinical assistant professor on the UC Davis clinical faculty, serving as a preceptor in a student-run free clinic. In March 2016, Bill co-founded a new nonprofit organization, Americans Against Gun Violence, and he currently serves as its president. This new organization extended the local work with Physicians for Social Responsibility on gun violence prevention to the national level. He has provided expert testimony on numerous occasions to the California legislature on firearm-related bills. He has published numerous articles concerning the need to adopt stringent gun control regulations in the United States, comparable to other high-income democratic countries in the world. And without any further delay, I introduce Bill Durston.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francine. Yeah, I wish we could all be in person because it's a different energy, but I think we're right on the cusp of being able to have in-person meetings again. In the meantime, I want to thank Francine, Charlene, Doug, everybody in the St. Francis Pathways for Justice Ministry for hosting this, for inviting me to speak. It's an honor. And as Francine said, I'd like to keep it as interactive as possible. So if you have comments, questions as I'm talking, and I'm going to present a slideshow here, please send a chat to Francine or Charlene, and then Francine and Charlene will feel free to interrupt me. All right, well, if all goes well, then I'm going to share this slideshow, and we'll see, start from beginning. All right, and can people see the slides then? I think I'm going to close that view. Okay. Can people see the title slide?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
good.
Looks good.
Anyway, so the title is Gun Violence in America, a Preventable Epidemic. And as Francine mentioned, I've been working on this for decades and obviously not with much success. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it still tonight. But anyway, hopefully we can have a discussion where can talk about what the obvious reasons are and what the obvious solutions are to stopping our epidemic of gun violence. When we talk about gun violence, it's usually in the setting of a horrific mass shooting. And these pictures are of the 20 children killed at the Sandy Hook elementary school mass shooting back in December of 2012. 6 female staff members were also killed, and the shooter's mother was also killed. Many of us thought that Sandy Hook would be the turning point when we would finally do something definitive to stop the epidemic of gun violence in our country. Fortunately, that didn't turn out to be the case. And I think many people have questioned after Sandy Hook, are we a country that loves its guns more than its children, to not do something to prevent these shootings, such as the one that killed all these innocent children. If you look at mass shootings going back to 1983 through close to the present, if you define a mass shooting as one in which at least 4 people are killed, the bar graph here shows the number of mass shootings, which are the numbers and the little blue bars in each 5-year epoch. The red bars, the number of people killed during the 5-year epoch, and the gray bars, the number of people wounded but not killed. You can see that there's been a trend for increasing number of mass shootings and also for an increasing number of victims. The increased number of victims per shooting probably related to the shooters using more and more lethal firearms. When we would do this type of talk in person, I'd ask people what percent of firearm deaths do they think are due to mass shootings. People would usually overestimate somewhere in the 10% category. The correct answer is probably it depends, because it depends on how you define a mass shooting. Some people or some agencies define a mass shooting as one in which at least 5 people, not including the shooter, are killed. And at the other end is the definition one in which at least 4 people are wounded, but nobody necessarily killed. So depending on the definition, the percentage of US firearm deaths due to mass shootings is somewhere from 0.3 to about 1.5%. So by any definition, mass shootings account for a small percentage of all the gun deaths in our country. On an average day in the United States, about 110 people are killed, and 2 to 3 times this number suffer non-fatal but often devastating, life-changing gunshot wounds. This graph shows the number of people killed per year from 1968 up to 2018. So now it's close to 40,000 a year. The 2019 data shows similar figure. The 2020 official data is not out yet, but according to unofficial data, we'll probably hit a new record high of something like 44,000 deaths in 2020, gun-related deaths in our country. The decline here from 1994 to 2000 corresponds with the enactment of the Brady Background Check Act in 1994 and the federal assault weapons ban. The federal assault weapons ban then sunsetted in 2004. It probably had little to do with this decline because the way it defined assault weapon was so narrow that the gun industry was able to make weapons that were every bit as deadly, but didn't meet the definition of an assault weapon. Furthermore, the assault weapons ban grandfathered in millions of so-called assault weapons already in circulation. The Brady Act, though, requiring background checks for gun purchases from federally licensed firearm dealers probably had at least something to do with that decline. But the Brady bill the Brady Act did not sunset. It's still in effect, and yet, as you can see, the annual number of gun deaths is still going up. Way back in 1991, the CDC did a study looking at the leading causes of years of potential life lost before age 65. And I apologize to, I think most of the people on this call for any implication that are on this conference, for any implication that after 65, it doesn't matter whether you die or not. But anyway, the point is, before age 65, firearms were the leading cause of death, fourth leading cause of death in our country, behind accidents, cancer, and heart disease. The CDC, as far as I know, hasn't done a similar study since 1991. I think, as many of you know, the Congress cut the CD's funding after it published this and other studies showing what a serious problem gun violence was. But since 1991, deaths due to accidents, particularly motor vehicle accidents, cancer, and heart disease have all gone down, whereas firearm-related deaths have gone up. When the final COVID data is in, of course, 600,000 plus people died of COVID, but the deaths were skewed on the older, toward older age groups. So for children, youth, and probably young adults, I think probably firearms, even in 2020 at the height of the COVID pandemic, firearms will probably outnumber COVID deaths for our children, people in their teens, and young adults. This graph just shows how motor vehicles deaths declined while firearm-related deaths went up from 1950 to mid-2000s. This is one of the more startling statistics, particularly as a veteran of the Vietnam War. Since 1968, more U.S. civilians have died of gunshot wounds than all the U.S. soldiers killed by any means in all the wars in which our country has ever been involved. And if we're doing a live talk, I would ask people to raise their hands. How many think that gunshot wounds are most gunshot wounds are the result of suicides or attempted suicides? And usually the majority of people would raise their hand. The fact is, though, if you look at just fatal gunshot wounds, self-harm or suicide accounts for more than half, in fact, almost 2/3 of gun-related deaths, and only assaults account for only about 1/3. And accidents, legal intervention, all for tiny percentages. If you look at non-fatal gunshot wounds, though, self-harm, which would be attempted suicide in this case, accounts for a small fraction, 4.1%. Whereas assaults account for almost 3/4, 75%. The big difference here, of course, is because when people try to kill themselves with a gun, they almost always succeed. But if you look at all gunshot wounds combined, this bottom row, almost 2/3 are due to assaults, about 22% due to intentional self-harm, suicide, attempted suicide, 14% accidents, and small amount due to legal intervention. You might wonder why this slide is 2014 data. The data comes from the Centers from Disease Control, something called the WISQARS, WISQUARS database. And the data is always about 2 years behind. So I last updated this in 2016. When I tried to update it in 2017, the non-fatal firearm data was gone. Not only were they no longer reporting new data, they had erased the old data, which I find interesting, and I'm not quite sure the reason for that. If we look at firearm-related death rates for men, and most firearm-related deaths do occur in males, this bar graph shows the death rate by age group, and it also shows it for 3 races, people classified as being Black, Hispanic, or white. And as you can see from this graph, there's a peak in firearm-related homicides, particularly from 15 to age 24. And the firearm-related homicide rate for Black males is astronomical. And that continues on even until age 65 plus. If you look at suicides, it's a different picture, where the blue bars, which correspond with whites, account for most suicides, or the highest suicide rates. And the rate keeps going up as white men get older. The types of guns used in fatal firearm injuries, they're handguns in the vast majority of cases, in homicides and in suicides. Rifles and shotguns account for a smaller percentage. Assault weapons, and I think we would all agree that semi-automatic, high-powered rifles that are specifically designed to kill and maim large numbers of people in a short period of time have no legitimate civilian use. And as I mentioned earlier, they're being used more and more in mass shootings. As far as overall firearm-related deaths, though, they account for a relatively small percentage.
Bill, we have a question.
Good. Go ahead, Charlene.
Okay, so the question is, it seems like there are 2 major gun control issues happening: mass shootings and suicides. Is it possible that mental health background checks to obtain guns may be a solution?
And I'm glad someone asked that. And I've got a slide coming up that refers to mental health. But as I pointed out earlier, actually about 3/4 of gunshot wounds in our country are assaults. So to say that the problem is suicides and mass shootings, I would say is inaccurate. Most shootings are due to assaults. Deaths, suicides count for more than half, and homicides about a third. But mass shootings, as horrific as they are, account for a small percentage. But we'll get to the mental health issue. I'm glad someone raised that. In fact, that may be, yeah, that's coming up right away, in fact. If you compare the United States to other high-income democratic countries, and OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and that basically represents the other high-income democratic countries of the world. Our gun death rate is 10 times higher than the average for the other high-income democratic countries. Our overall homicide rate is, that is, homicide by any means, is 7 times higher. And that's driven by a gun homicide rate that is 25 times higher. For US teens, ages, I think it's 14 to 19, our gun homicide rate is 82 times higher than the average for the other 22 high-income democratic countries. Our gun suicide rate is 8 times higher. If it weren't for gun suicides, the United States would have one of the lowest suicide rates of any high-income democratic country in the world. And the point that substitution doesn't generally occur refers to the fact that when availability to firearms is reduced, gun-related homicides and gun-related suicides go down, but rates of non-gun homicide, non-gun suicide don't go up. So the lower your gun homicide, gun suicide rate in general, the lower the overall homicide and suicide rate in a country. There are a few exceptions, Japan being an exception with suicide rate. It has a high suicide rate, but basically almost completely bans civilian ownership of guns and has a high non-gun suicide rate, which is thought to be due to cultural norms. So anyway, in summary, firearm-related deaths and injuries are a serious public health problem in the United States, and we have an extraordinarily high rate of gun-related deaths and injuries as compared with all other high-income democratic countries. So going back to the question that was just asked, what are the reasons for our extraordinarily high rate of gun violence? Culture violence, media violence is often talked about. And I think we would all agree that we need to address that as a problem on the media violence, in particular the violent video games and that type of thing, the pandering to gun violence in our motion picture industry. But other countries see the same movies and the kids play the same video games. Something that surprised me was that if you look at rates of non-fatal assaults, criminal assaults in the high-income democratic countries, by any means, the United States is actually below average in the rate of non-fatal criminal assaults. The reason our homicide rate is 7 times higher than the average for the other countries is because assaults are committed using guns so much more often in our country than in any other high-income democratic country. So we need to address the culture of violence, and yet compared to other high-income democratic countries, we aren't really more violent. We just use guns more often. All right, what about socioeconomic disparity and institutional racism? There's something called the Gini coefficient that gives a number to income disparity. That doesn't account for all socioeconomic, but it's some clue. So a Gini coefficient of 0 would mean that everybody's income is the same in the country. And higher Gini coefficients mean more income disparity. So you can see we're higher than some other high-income democratic countries. But Great Britain has 1/60th the rate of gun deaths that we have in the United States, and yet it's got a higher Gini coefficient. What about institutional racism? Well, clearly we're the only high-income democratic country in the world that was founded at a time when we had institutionalized slavery. So we can't deny that we have institutional racism going way back to the very earliest days of the founding of our country. If you look, there's a database called Fatal Encounters, and that includes all encounters with police in which the suspect died. Most of those were cases in which police shot the suspect. Some cases in which the suspect committed suicide. Others, like the George Floyd case, in which the police literally murdered the suspect in George Floyd's case by kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes. Others could be cases where there's a high-speed chase and the suspect died in a crash. But if you look at all fatal encounters with police during this 5-year epic, blacks, and this is just going to the database, somebody classified as black or white, accounted for 13% of our population by census data, but 27% of deaths in fatal encounters with police. So blacks were killed in fatal encounters a little bit more than twice as often as you expect based on the percentage of the population. Whites, on the other hand, accounted for 76% of the population, but 43% of fatal encounter deaths. So from this data, you would say blacks died in fatal encounters with police 3.6 times more often than whites. So they were killed by police in disproportionate numbers compared with whites. There's another important way of looking at this, though. If you assume that all the fatal encounter with police deaths were homicide, and forget whether you consider them justifiable or not. Fatal encounters with police accounted for 3.2% of all homicides during this 5-year period, and people classified as being black. They accounted for 5.6% of all homicides in people classified as white. So in relation to total homicides in their racial group, whites were killed during encounters with police almost twice as often as blacks, which I found surprising. Now, FBI data consistently shows that most murders are committed with guns and by persons known to the victim and of the same race. This, I'm sure, provides no solace to the loved ones of the members of the Methodist Emmanuel African Church in Charleston who were killed by a white supremacist back in 2015, or to the loved ones and friends, family of David Green and Ramona Cooper, who were killed Saturday by a white supremacist in Winthrop, Massachusetts. Both Dylan Roof and the shooter Nathan Allen in the Winthrop mass shooting were avowed white supremacists who are legally able to purchase handguns under our country's background check laws. Anyway, but going on, looking at percentage of fatal shootings by police versus percent of the population.
Bill, before you get into that, we have a couple of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Here's the first one. Since we aren't likely to get meaningful bipartisan gun control legislation in the current polarized environment, I wonder if we could have a Paris Accord of sorts among the OECD countries. That may be something the president can do to try to step further forward.
Well, this is very interesting because climate change is a very complex problem, and if the United States were to, totally eliminate our greenhouse gas emission, it would have some effect, but not a major effect on climate change. The same with COVID. I mean, that was a worldwide pandemic, and we based what we did in part on what other countries did. Our first vaccine was produced in another country. So that was a complex problem. Look at gun violence. We're the only outlier compared to all these other high-income democratic countries. So we don't have to have an international conference. We already have all the international data. And I would particularly point out, last fall we had Michael North of Scotland as our keynote speaker at a Zoom conference like this. He goes by Mick. He was a biochemist. He lost his daughter, Sophie, 5 years old, in a mass shooting at the Dunblane Primary School in Scotland, 1996. In that primary school mass shooting, 16 students and a teacher were killed. That accounted for half of all the deaths in Scotland in the year, all the gun deaths. Within 2 years, Mick North and the Dunblane, other grieving Dunblane parents, had gotten a complete ban on handguns passed in Great Britain. And Great Britain also has a gun lobby. There hasn't been a single school shooting since they got that ban passed. And as I said, the rate of gun deaths in Great Britain is 1/60th the rate in the United States. So we don't need an international conference. We need to do the obvious thing, which is, and that's the bottom line of this whole talk, we need to adopt stringent gun control like other high-income democratic countries. We need to adopt a complete handgun ban like Great Britain did within 2 years after the Dunblane mass shooting, and a complete ban on all automatic and semi-automatic long guns like Great Britain did after the Hungerford mass shooting, like New Zealand did, and like Australia did. Australia within 2 weeks of the 1996 Port Arthur mass shooting, and New Zealand within 2 weeks of the 2019 Christchurch mass shooting. That's the bottom line of this whole talk.
Mm-hmm. We have one more question, one additional question, Bill.
Yes.
And it is, what was the source again on the black-white rate of FEWP?
The source. There are 4 sources. There's something called Fatal Encounters. It's a database of all people who died during an encounter with police by any cause. And then there's census data, of course, on Black and white in the population. And then as far as homicides, the CDC Whiskers, WISQARS database gives homicides in a given year, and you can do it by race, you can do it by age group, and you can divide it into gun-related or not gun-related. And then there's one other database, which I'll talk about now, fatal shootings, just fatal shootings. So in these cases, the police definitely shot and killed the person. Again, the fatal shootings, the data I use is from the Washington Post. If you look at government statistics, they show a smaller number than the Washington Post, which uses all news reports. According to the Washington Post figures, fatal shootings by police, Blacks accounted for 26% of people fatally shot by police, whites 51%, and the same figures from the census data in the population. So looking at that, Blacks were fatally shot by police 3 times more often than whites. So you'd say, yeah, the systemic racism is what's causing the problem.
But
But
Bill,
again, yes, go ahead.
before we go on, we just have another question that just popped up.
Good.
And you might be addressing it later on, but the question is, how does the Second Amendment affect the ability to control guns?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, and you're right. Definitely go into that. So I'll just finish with this. If you look at it the other way around, though, this fatal shootings by police accounted for 2.9% of all gun homicides in Blacks versus 8% of all gun homicides in whites. So if you look at it from that point of view, it would look like whites are fatally shot almost 3 times as often as Blacks by police. So institutional racism is no doubt, it's a serious problem in the United States. But fatal encounters with police, whether you include all fatal encounters or just fatal shootings, they only account for, I shouldn't say only, because they're, in many cases they're horrific, but they account for about 3% of all homicides in Black Americans. So we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to decide, all right, what are the most important things we can do to, stop the carnage. So, and then going on to the question of mental illness, drug and alcohol use, again, if you compare the United States to other high-income democratic countries, and here are just a few, this is self-reported prevalence of any anxiety or any mood disorder or any substance use disorder. And self-reported, if you look at a combination of any mental health disorder, any substance disorder, we're a little higher than the reported levels in other high-income democratic countries. Whether it's we really are worse as far as mental illness and substance abuse, or whether we're just report it more, don't know. So we're probably a little higher, but we're not an extreme outlier. Pardon me. If you look at guns per population, though, this is the United States. These are the other high-income democratic countries. That's where we're an extreme outlier.
And Bill, this is a good time to ask this next question, I think. If governments would pay for it, do you think gun buyback programs could help reduce firearm deaths?
Yes, when Great Britain banned handguns, and prior to that, it banned semi-automatic long guns. It banned them all with no grandfather clause. So you couldn't keep one if you already had one. And then the government did compensate people for turning them in. So they got rid of all the guns and they compensated people. So that's a buyback program that worked. Same in New Zealand and Australia. They said you can no longer have a semi-automatic or automatic long gun. They banned them. Everybody had to turn them in, and they compensated for it. Now, buybacks in the United States haven't been associated with bans. So they'll buy, you have to buy a gun buyback, and you pay somebody for turning in their old gun, and they take the money and go out and buy a new, more lethal version. So buybacks work if they're associated with bans with no grandfather clause. Grandfather clause means that somebody who already has the gun can keep it. And that's part of the reason why the federal assault weapons ban was so ineffective. Here's one graph, just remember, again, a few take-home points. Think of this graph. Here is the number of privately owned guns per capita in countries, and these dots represent the other high-income democratic countries. And here's annual gun deaths per 100,000 population, so the rate of gun deaths. Every other country down here, low gun ownership, low gun deaths. We're out here, high gun ownership, high gun deaths. So when people say we can stop gun violence in our country by means other than getting rid of a large portion of the guns, that they're claiming we can go from here to here without going down here. And no country has ever done that before. The differences between our laws and the other laws in other countries, we've already talked about in part. The response to mass shooting, the other countries enact complete bans, and we send thoughts and prayers, and we give the gun industry immunity from products liability, prohibit use of federal funds to advocate gun control, and so on. Another thing people don't recognize, though, is our basic underlying premise is different than every other high-income democratic country. In every other high-income democratic country, if you want to purchase a gun, you have to show you have a reason to purchase the gun. In the United States, you don't have to show any reason. Like Dylan Roof and Nathan Allen, they bought guns to go out and kill people of another race because they were, white supremacists. But if they weren't on a database that prohibited them from owning guns. And furthermore, in the other high-income democratic countries, many of them, like Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, they don't recognize self-defense as a legitimate reason for owning a gun because they know that there is no net protective value from civilians in a democratic society from owning or carrying a gun. In fact, guns confer far more risk than benefit. So that is something we need to change. So our lax gun control laws and high rates of gun ownership explain why we are such an outlier. Not that these other issues of racism, mental illness, drug abuse, and so on aren't problems, but the main reason why we're such an extreme outlier is our lax gun control laws and the fact that our country is swarming with guns.
But Bill, somebody just asked the question, and I think I'm reading it right. It says, talk about the IRA as they give money to the members of Congress. I'm not sure. Do you know what that's referring to?
I assume the NRA. Although...
No, it says IRA. Oh, no, maybe it is the NRA. Okay, that makes better sense, NRA.
Yeah, actually the plumbers union gives more money to Congress than the NRA. So yeah, we can't, blame it on that. And anyway, I'll go on and address that in a little bit later. But anyway, somebody talked about the Second Amendment. Well, and I would ask people, if we're doing it in person, what does the Second Amendment say? And there'd usually be some mumbling about right to bear arms. Well, the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You could turn it around and say, the reason the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed is because we need a well-regulated militia. And when I ask people, when was the first time the Second Amendment was ever interpreted as conferring an individual right to own guns, people would guess all over the place. Well, it wasn't until 2008, the Heller decision. In all these other decisions, the Supreme Court ruled the Second Amendment did not confer an individual right to own guns unrelated to service in a well-regulated militia. In fact, in Lewis in 1980, the Supreme Court said the Second Amendment guarantees no right to keep and bear a firearm that doesn't have some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. And in 2008, 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court reversed over 2 centuries of legal precedent in ruling that Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban violated the Second Amendment. The Heller decision has been called snow job, gun rights propaganda passing a scholarship. The late Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, in his autobiography, said it was unquestionably the most clearly incorrect decision that the court announced during his 35-year tenure on the bench. In Heller, the gun lobby, or the 5-member majority endorsed the gun lobby's rewrite of the Second Amendment, which basically eliminates much of the first part and rewrites the second part. And Warren Burger called that version of the Second Amendment one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I've ever seen in my lifetime. Clearly, we need to overturn the Heller decision. We do not need to rescind the Second Amendment. I'll go through this very quickly since we're getting close on time. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Second Amendment was ever intended to confer an individual right to own guns. The Heller decision, written by Antonin Scalia, claims one of the reasons for the Second Amendment was to provide a constitutional right to armed insurrection. That's completely false. The Constitution was adopted, or they decided they needed a constitution and a stronger federal government because they couldn't put down Shays' rebellion. So it was specifically to put down a rebellion that the Constitution was written and the federal government was given more power over the militia. And after the Constitution was in effect and after the Second Amendment was adopted, there were more armed revolts, usually about taxes or something like that. And the people who fomented these revolts didn't get a pass because they were exercising their Second Amendment rights. They were convicted of treason. So that's ridiculous. The politically correct interpretation of why we got a Second Amendment was to substitute a volunteer militia for a standing army. But the problem with that is George Washington himself said there's no way that volunteer militia will work to defend our country. The contrary to the myth, the Revolutionary War wasn't won by volunteer militias, won by a professional army with guns that we imported from Europe after the war began. Now, this last potential reason to reassure Southern states they could maintain armed slave patrols. When I'd be doing this talk in person, I'd see eyes roll when I mention that. But then I would ask, okay, well, how many parts or clauses are there in the Constitution that undoubtedly were included to preserve slavery? And most people would know. The correct answer is 4. There are 4 parts in the original Constitution that were specifically included to perpetuate the institution of slavery. The 3/5 representation, and notice in every case they use some euphemism for slavery. A clause saying that we can't ban importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, referring to slaves prior to 1808. Some person held to service or labor goes across state lines, they have to return to their owner, that refers to slaves. And then in Article 5, these articles can't be amended prior to 1808. To get to the gun lobby's view of the Second Amendment, you have to eliminate the whole first part about the well-regulated militia. You have to change the right of the people to the right of individual people, because the people is used in collective sense throughout the Second Amendment. You have to change keep and bear arms to own and carry guns for personal use, because keep and bear arms during the founding era almost always referred to military weapons in military service. To get to what I call the slave state version of the Second Amendment, you have to change 2 words. Change free state to slave state, and the southern states were slave states, and change the right of the people to the right of white people to keep and bear arms. And slaves and freed blacks were both forbidden from carrying arms. And then you probably get to most likely to the real reason the Second Amendment was adopted. So at best, the Second Amendment was what Washington called a chimerical attempt to replace the need for a standing army with volunteer militia. At worst, and more likely, it was to reassure the southern slave states they could keep their militias, which were one and the same as their slave patrol. There's just another book published on this topic called The Second. And so this interpretation of the Second Amendment is not radical as it once seemed, it's probably the most likely case. I'm going to skip all these cases regarding how this Heller decision has been not only brought up again, but extended. And there's a case coming up in the Supreme Court. These cases, these three, Duncan v. Becerra, Road v. Becerra, Miller v. Bonta, this one overturned our large capacity magazine ban. This one overturned the ammunition background check, and Miller v. Bonta attempts to overturn our assault weapons ban. This is the one where the same judge, Roger Benitez, this is the one in which he said that AR-15s are like Swiss Army knives. They're all on appeal to the full Ninth Circuit at this point. But Heller is worse than all that I've described in creating a constitutional obstacle where none previously existed to the adoption of stringent gun control laws in our country comparable to those in every other high-income democratic country. It's literally a death sentence for tens of thousands of Americans annually. Myth number two, and I'll just briefly go over this, is the myth that honest, law-abiding people should own or carry guns for protection. There's a Ladies' Home Journal ad from many years ago implying that mom should have a handgun in her robe pocket when she tucks her little one into bed at night. There's overwhelming evidence that guns in the homes and the communities of honest, law-abiding people are much more likely to harm them than protect them. They knew that at the time of the Heller decision. Since Heller, more evidence has been shown, including FBI evidence showing that the ratio of gun murders to justifiable gun homicides in self-defense is 34-1. Myth number three, we can stop the epidemic of gun violence in our country without drastically reducing the pool of privately owned guns. And this is from Giffords, which is recognized as one of our leading gun violence prevention organizations. Never mind that no serious organization advocates for mass firearm confiscation. I wouldn't use confiscation, but certainly Americans Against Gun Violence advocates that we need to ban handguns and semi-automatics and have people surrender them in return for compensation. Or that collecting America's 357 million firearms would be a logistical impossibility. Well, we dismantle 10 to 12 million cars every year. It's a lot easier to dismantle a gun than a car. In reality, smart gun laws are about saving lives and ensuring responsible gun ownership, not taking away guns. Well, again, if you look at this graph, and this is now a computer-generated best fit line, anybody or any organization says we can reduce gun deaths in our country without reducing guns per capita is saying that we can do what no other high-income democratic country has ever done. The problem is these other gun violence prevention organizations are afraid to be called gun grabbers, and they instead recommend what they call common sense gun regulations, expanding background checks. But you have to recognize that background checks, as they're done in the United States, even if they're done for every single gun purchase, not just those through federally licensed firearm dealers, they're just comparing somebody to a database, and the databases are perennially incomplete, with the main prohibition category being an involuntary commission for mental illness or being a felon. And even most mass shooters in the United States pass background checks and legally buy the guns they use in the mass shootings because they're such a crude instrument. In other high-income democratic countries, first you have to have a good reason to own the gun before they even do a background check. And self-defense isn't considered a legitimate reason in many of those countries. And then the police go out and talk to you. They talk to intimate partners, former intimate partners, other people who know you, to try to be sure that you're of good character. And basically the basic reasons for having a gun are if you're a legitimate hunter or target shooter. The other organizations, and President Biden talks about renewing the federal assault weapons ban. Well, our assault weapons ban was largely ineffective. What we need to do is ban all automatic and semi-automatic long guns with no grandfather clause. Extreme risk protection orders. When somebody is identified as being extreme risk for hurting himself or herself or others, there's a complicated process you can go through to try to get a gun temporarily removed. Well, we sell in California in 2020 over 1 million guns, and the ERPO law was invoked 400 times. So you can see what a drop in the bucket that is. The Indiana FedEx shooter had a gun taken away from him through an extreme risk protection order. And then later next year went on to buy the gun he used in the mass shooting. More research is another one that they advocate. We've had enough research since 1968 to know we need to adopt gun control laws like other high-income democratic countries. When you talk about common sense gun laws, given that our rate of gun deaths is 10 times higher than the other high-income democratic countries, I think it defies common sense to do anything other than or adopt stringent gun control like those other high-income democratic countries. I'm going to skip to the end.
Bill, we have a couple of questions that just popped
go
up.
ahead.
The first one is, how do you define long gun? And then the second one is, how realistic is it to have legislatures, federal and state, to ban all handguns? I support this approach, but worry would be banging my head against a brick wall.
Well, as I mentioned, Mick North and a handful of grieving Dunblane parents in 1996, between 1996 and 98, they got a complete handgun ban passed in Great Britain, despite all odds. If they can do it, we should be able to do it. But nobody's even talking about it. Go to this Abraham Lincoln quote. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he, and we would add she, who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes. We need to make this possible by talking about it, demanding that it be done, pointing out that it's the obvious thing to do. And we can't have a nihilistic attitude. This I always end with. Think of Nelson Mandela, who not single-handedly, but led the movement to overcome apartheid while he's in solitary confinement in prison for 27 years. If he can do that, we can do what every other high-income democratic country has already done. But we have to be vocal about it. We have to be public. We have to contact our elected officials, talk with friends, family members, and call out elected officials, journalists, bloggers, and even other gun violence prevention organizations that promote these baby steps, and even go out of the way to say, well, we're not going to take away any guns. Say, yeah, we're going to take away millions and millions and millions of guns, so that we go back to the beginning, just like they did in Dunblane. As I mentioned, the 16 kids who were killed in Dunblane were half of all the people murdered in the entire country. These 20 kids were a tiny fraction of all the people murdered in our entire country. And we need to prove through our actions, not just our words, that we're a country that loves its children more than its guns, if nothing else, than just to prevent another mass shooting like this one that occurred at Sandy Hook.
Bill, there was one other question. This was very informative, but there was one other question. Can you define what a long gun is?
Yeah, and actually there's, a range there. The Indiana shooter used a sawed-off version of an AR-15, but generally you're talking about rifles, shotguns. Long gun is to include shotguns as well. There's a semi-automatic version of shotgun as opposed to handguns. There is a in-between zone where the AR-15 type rifle is sold in a shorter version to make it more concealable. But whether you call it it's semi-automatic, so whether you call it a handgun or a semi-automatic long gun, either way, we should ban it.
Thank you. Charlene?
Oh, wow. I have to unravel my brain here. So thank you so very much, Bill. On behalf of the St. Francis Pathways for Justice, we want to thank you for an extremely informative and enlightening presentation on this super important issue. Your presentation offers a foundational perspective of this epidemic. which profoundly impacts our nation. Thank you so much again for taking
Thank
the
you.
time
Thank you.
to
Thank you.
meet with us.
And I
And for those of you, we always try to be respectful of your time. So for those of you who would like to maybe stay on for another 15 minutes, Bill has graciously offered to stay on for about another 15 minutes for those of you who would like to maybe ask some more questions and get some additional information and insight. And thank you again, Bill, for
Thank you.
making yourself available. But we will do what we know how to do well. We will end this presentation, this enormously important presentation, with a prayer. And the prayer is, let the shooting end. God, our hearts are broken with pain at the senseless deaths caused by gun violence. Families mourn, children live in fear, and some in our nation respond by arming themselves with more guns with greater capacity to end life. Our disconnection and alienation have caused some to turn to guns for protection and safety. We ask that you touch our hearts with your love, heal our brokenness, and turn us away from violence toward peace. Help us to transform our own hearts and to seek peaceful ways of resolving our differences. Let our hands reach out and connect with those who feel alone, those who live in fear, and those suffering from mental illness. Let our voices be raised, asking our legislators to enact gun laws to protect all in our society, especially those most vulnerable. Let our pens write messages demanding change while also scripting words of hope and transformation. We ask this in the name of God, who desires that we live together in peace. Amen.
And
Good night to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Durson, and thank all of you for attending.